It's 2 a.m. She's on her porch, whispering, "The silence feels louder with you." It was just past 2 in the morning when I noticed the soft glow on her porch. Most nights, the house was dark, quiet, the world beyond my window muffled by the late-hour calm. But tonight, the light flickered, spilling golden warmth across the steps, and for some reason, I felt compelled to look closer. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from her garden, a fragrance that seemed to linger longer when the night was still. My footsteps on the gravel were deliberate but hushed, each crunch sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. I paused at the edge of her yard, not wanting to intrude but unable to pull my gaze away. There she was, sitting in the soft halo of the porch light, her silhouette outlined with a kind of serene grace. The swing beneath her shifted slightly as she moved, the chains whispering against the metal frame. She hadn't noticed me yet, or maybe she had, and she was pretending not to. Either way, there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the space between us, fragile, almost electric. Her hair fell loosely over one shoulder, catching the light just enough to highlight the subtle warmth of her skin. She wore something comfortable, casual, but even in its simplicity, it suited her. There was confidence in the way she sat, the gentle curve of her posture, but also a quiet vulnerability I couldn't quite name. The contrast made my chest tighten without warning. It was strange, feeling this pull toward someone I barely knew, someone who existed in the same neighborhood but in a world slightly removed from mine. I shifted, and the gravel responded, a small crunch. She looked up then, and for a moment, everything else blurred. The night air, the jasmine, the distant hum of the city. Her eyes met mine, warm and steady, and she offered a half-smile that made the silence feel almost intentional. It was a smile that carried curiosity, a subtle invitation, and maybe even a hint of recognition. My own lips parted in response before I could stop them, though no words came. I realized then that the quiet wasn't empty. It was heavy with possibility. Each pause between us was a conversation in itself, filled with tension I didn't yet understand but couldn't ignore. There was a rhythm to the moment, the gentle sway of the swing, the distant call of a night bird, the steady beat of my own pulse that seemed loud against the backdrop of her calm. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but hesitated, aware of the line between curiosity and intrusion. Still, I lingered there, captivated. Something about the late hour, the stillness, the soft glow, and the way she held herself made it feel like the world had shrunk just enough for us to exist in this suspended, quiet bubble. And in that bubble, I sensed the very beginning of something I couldn't yet name, an awareness of her presence that made the silence feel strangely louder than it had before. A few nights later, I found myself walking past her porch again. The light was on, softer this time, casting a gentle glow over the familiar swing. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything, just walking off the restlessness of the night. But when I saw her there, sipping from a mug that steamed in the cool air, I felt the same pull I couldn't name. She looked up, catching my eyes, and for a moment, the world outside that porch seemed irrelevant. "Can't sleep?" I asked quietly, careful not to startle her. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile curving her lips. "Sometimes the night feels longer when there's no one to share it with." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, and it carried a warmth that made me want to lean closer, to stay just a little longer. We fell into an easy rhythm, talking about small things, the night air, the quiet streets, the subtle hum of the city at this hour. There was nothing extraordinary in the words themselves, but every pause, every glance, carried weight. She laughed quietly at something I said, and the sound was like a gentle ripple across the stillness, leaving a warmth that lingered long after it faded. I noticed how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the motion effortless, but somehow intimate. Her hand brushed the mug as she held it, and I felt a strange awareness of proximity, of space shared without needing to speak about it. I could see the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. Each detail settled in my mind like a photograph I wasn't meant to capture, yet couldn't forget. The conversation slowed, and the quiet returned, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Our shoulders were almost brushing now, though neither of us moved. I felt a small thrill at the closeness, tempered by the awareness that this was still the very beginning, a tentative dance along the edges of something I didn't yet understand. She said nothing for a moment, just watching the way the porch light caught the glint of dew on the railing. I realized then that the silence wasn't empty. It was layered, full of all the things we didn't dare say aloud. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but hesitated, aware that the weight of that simple gesture might change everything. And then, without warning, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It's strange how quiet the world can feel with someone beside you, and yet, how much louder it seems too. Her words hung in the air between us. I didn't respond. Not yet. Just let the moment stretch, letting her meaning settle in my chest. The night felt charged, alive, as if it were holding its breath with us. And I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that the beginning of something real often arrives in quiet, measured moments like this. Small touches, shared silences, glances that lingered just a heartbeat too long. When I finally walked back to my place, the echo of her presence stayed with me. The porch light, the soft warmth of her voice, the subtle closeness. It all pulled at me, making the ordinary night feel extraordinary. And I knew I'd be back, not just out of curiosity, but because I couldn't ignore the quiet insistence of this growing connection. The nights that followed, I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. Not in the obvious sense, her elegance or the easy way she carried herself, but in the small, unspoken habits that made her feel profoundly human, profoundly present. Sometimes I would glance out my window just to see if the porch light was on, and if it was, I would catch her moving gently through her space. The way she hummed softly while tending to a pot of tea, or the careful way she folded her hands over her knees when she settled into the swing. It wasn't intrusive. It was observation born of curiosity and a quiet, unacknowledged longing. I began to recognize patterns, rhythms, and moments where her world and mine seemed to brush against each other without words. One night, she paused mid-step, adjusting a flower pot, and the light caught the curve of her jaw. My chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. There was grace in her movements, yes, but also a kind of solitude that made her seem both fragile and steady at the same time. The porch became a stage for these subtle interactions. She would glance up occasionally, catching me just at the edge of vision. Sometimes her smile was quick, almost shy, and sometimes it lingered, as if she knew I was watching and found comfort in it. In response, I would nod, offer a small, wordless acknowledgement, careful not to break the quiet intimacy of the moment. Each brief exchange became its own kind of conversation, speaking in glances and gestures rather than sentences. I realized I was attuned to the smallest details, the faint rustle of her hair as she leaned forward, the soft exhale that followed a laugh she let escape when she thought no one could hear. Even the scent of her home drifting faintly on the night air became part of the memory I carried. It was a mixture of jasmine from her garden, the subtle warmth of tea, and something uniquely hers, an invisible signature that marked her presence wherever she moved. These nights weren't dramatic. There were no declarations, no sweeping gestures. Yet the tension between us was undeniable. Every brush of shoulders when she shifted on the swing, every lingering glance across the yard, pulled at something inside me. A tension that was both comforting and electrifying. I wanted to step closer, to close the small distance between us, but I hesitated, aware that this was a delicate rhythm, one that shouldn't be forced. And then, sometimes, she would notice my gaze. Her eyes would hold mine for just a fraction longer than normal, and the air would thrum with unspoken recognition. I imagined her feeling it too. The quiet pull, the awareness that someone else noticed the world as she did, that someone else lingered in the spaces she had made for herself. It became a nightly ritual, silent yet charged. I would return to my window or my porch, and she to hers, and for a few hours, the world was reduced to the distance between us, the space where longing and curiosity hovered like a tangible presence. And in that slow, careful observation, I began to understand the power of unspoken connection, the way attraction could exist quietly, almost invisibly yet shape everything we felt. By the time I finally turned away for the night, the feeling lingered, a gentle ache in my chest that whispered I was already entangled in something I couldn't yet name, something that was only just beginning to take hold. One night, she invited me to sit a little longer on the porch, as if sensing I was lingering outside anyway. The air was cooler than usual, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed hours before, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. She didn't say much at first, just rocked gently on the swing, her hands wrapped around a mug that steamed in the night air. I hesitated before stepping closer, aware that the space between us carried its own fragile tension. And then she spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. Sometimes, it feels like the world is too loud, and the quiet makes everything inside feel heavier. There was a pause, a small shiver in her tone, as if she weren't used to sharing this side of herself. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I just nodded, letting my presence convey what words couldn't. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was intimate, inviting her to continue, to trust that I could hold her unspoken thoughts without judgment. Her hands moved slightly, brushing against the rim of the mug, and I noticed how close our knees had come without either of us realizing it. The warmth radiating from her body was subtle but unmistakable, and for a moment, I became acutely aware of every tiny movement she made. Her shoulder brushed against mine as she shifted on the swing, and the contact, however brief, sent a quiet warmth through me. It was a gentle, grounding reminder that this connection, though tentative, was real. I don't usually talk like this, she admitted, eyes downcast, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the mug. I mean, to anyone. There was a vulnerability in her tone that made my chest tighten. I reached out almost instinctively, resting a hand lightly near hers on the railing, careful not to cross any line. The air between our hands was charged, not with urgency, but with recognition, an acknowledgement that we were both sharing a moment far more intimate than words could capture. She looked up then, meeting my gaze, and her eyes held a mixture of hesitation and relief, as if she had been carrying something alone for too long. I felt the steady rhythm of her pulse through the brief brush of our hands, a quiet affirmation that she was here, present, trusting me with this fragile piece of herself. The night around us, the soft hum of distant traffic, the faint rustle of leaves, seemed to recede, leaving just the two of us suspended in a small bubble of quiet understanding. The tension wasn't just romantic. It was emotional, layered with mutual recognition that vulnerability was a form of intimacy in itself. There were no declarations, no sudden gestures, only the slow, deliberate acknowledgement of presence. A shared breath, a fleeting touch, the kind of connection that lingers long after the moment has passed. When the conversation ended, and she sipped from her mug again, I realized something profound. These nights weren't about urgency or resolution. They were about building trust, about slowly letting someone in, and about learning to carry another person's quiet weight alongside your own. And in that realization, I understood that our connection, delicate, tender, and entirely unspoken, was already beginning to shape the way I experienced the night itself. One night, rain began falling unexpectedly, soft at first, then steady enough that stepping outside without shelter would leave you drenched. I found myself pacing the sidewalk, unsure whether to retreat or continue walking past her porch. The light was on again, and there she was, holding a small umbrella, already soaking from a brief attempt to save her plants. The sight pulled me closer. Something about the way she moved in the rain, calm yet unhurried, made the air between us feel electric. Without a word, she gestured toward the porch. I joined her, stepping under the cover of the small overhang. The rain drummed lightly on the roof above, mixing with the scent of wet earth and the lingering aroma of jasmine from her garden. The atmosphere was intimate, quiet, and somehow charged, as though the world had shrunk to fit the space of that small porch. We sat on the swing together, not forced, just naturally finding a spot where our shoulders brushed. The contact was minimal, tentative, yet it sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the chill of the night. Her hair brushed my arm as she leaned slightly to adjust her position, and the motion, almost accidental, made the tension between us thrum softly. We didn't speak at first, letting the sound of the rain and the rhythm of the swing carry the moment. Eventually, she tilted her head toward me, a small smile curving her lips. There was something in that glance, a recognition, a shared understanding, that spoke louder than words. My hand hovered near hers, unsure whether to touch, yet fully aware of the magnetic pull of proximity. The night seemed to hold its breath as we existed side by side, close enough to feel each other's warmth but careful not to overstep. I noticed the subtle changes in her breathing, the slight catch when our knees brushed, the way her hand rested near mine on the railing. Each detail was amplified by the quiet of the night and the intimacy of shared vulnerability. The connection wasn't rushed. It wasn't about passion. It was about being present, letting closeness and attraction speak for themselves. The warmth wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a tangible recognition of mutual interest and trust. We spoke eventually, in hushed tones, about trivial things. The unpredictability of rain, the small joys of night walks, memories that surfaced in quiet reflection. Each word, though casual, carried layers of meaning. A pause became loaded with intent. A laugh lingered longer than necessary. Every shared silence, every subtle touch, every glance stretched the invisible thread connecting us. By the time the rain eased, and the streets glistened under the dim porch light, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The physical closeness had made the emotional tension undeniable. We weren't just neighbors passing in the night. We were two people slowly discovering the contours of a connection neither of us fully understood but both of us wanted to explore. That night, the world felt simultaneously vast and intimate, charged with a quiet promise of what was beginning to bloom between us. The next time I found myself on her porch, the night was still, almost reverently so. The city sounds had faded into a gentle hum in the distance, leaving just the soft glow of her porch light and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. We had fallen into an easy, unspoken rhythm over the past nights, but tonight felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something unspoken was finally about to surface. She sat on the swing, her knees drawn slightly toward her chest, the edges of her mug catching the light. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the rim of the cup. Something told me she was about to share a piece of herself that she had held back until now. I stayed silent, letting her set the pace, my presence steady and deliberate. Then, softly, almost hesitantly, she whispered the words that made the world tilt slightly on its axis. "The silence feels louder with you." The phrase hung in the air, delicate yet profound, a confession wrapped in quiet intimacy. My chest tightened, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the night air. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that we had been threading toward this moment with every glance, every pause, every subtle brush of skin. I responded gently, carefully, my voice low and sincere. "I've felt it too. Even when there's nothing said, it feels different being here with you." There was a pause, and in that pause, everything we had been feeling, hesitation, curiosity, longing, settled into a tangible presence between us. It was not rushed, not forced. It was the quiet understanding of two people who had been slowly discovering the contours of an emotional connection. Our hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining in a way that felt effortless yet significant. The warmth of her palm against mine, the subtle pressure of her hand curling around my fingers, made the quiet night seem almost alive. The swing rocked gently beneath us, and the subtle rhythm mirrored the quiet beat of our hearts sinking in unspoken agreement. We talked then, softly, sharing thoughts that had lingered in the space between us for nights, about dreams, regrets, and small hopes. Her voice carried a gentle vulnerability that drew me in, and I realized that the age difference between us, so obvious on paper, had dissolved in the warmth of emotional intimacy. Experience and youth, wisdom and curiosity, they blended effortlessly in that quiet corner of the world. The night seemed to stretch, giving us space to linger in that connection. Every glance, every small movement, her shoulder brushing mine, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes held mine, spoke volumes. It was a confession, yes, but also an invitation. To stay, to explore, to be present with each other in the slow, deliberate unfolding of something rare and profound. By the time the night began to wane and the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon, we sat there, hand in hand, fully aware of what had begun. The silence was no longer loud. It was filled with warmth, understanding, and a tender promise of what was still to come. After that night, the rhythm of our evenings shifted subtly but unmistakably. The porch, once a place of tentative glances and quiet observation, had become a shared sanctuary. We no longer needed words to mark our presence. Even the smallest gestures, a hand reaching for another, a shoulder brushing against mine, the tilt of a head catching the light, spoke volumes. The tension that had once hummed beneath the surface now felt like a gentle current, steady and reassuring, guiding us closer without haste. The days that followed were filled with small, intimate moments that deepened our connection. She would greet me with a soft smile, lingering slightly longer than necessary, and I found myself looking forward to these encounters with a quiet anticipation that was both thrilling and comforting. There were still pauses in conversation, silences that might have felt awkward to anyone else, but with her, the quiet was filled with understanding. Every laugh, every shared observation about the world around us, every subtle touch became part of the unspoken dialogue that defined our bond. One evening, we lingered on the porch long after the streetlights flickered on. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flowers from her garden, and the swing beneath us creaked softly as we shifted closer. Her hand found mine again, fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. There was no need for grand declarations. The warmth of our connection was enough. Her eyes held a depth of emotion that mirrored my own, and in that gaze, I felt the steady pull of mutual understanding, respect, and affection. We spoke of trivial things, books we were reading, memories from our past, but beneath the casual conversation lay an undercurrent of intimacy. She would occasionally rest her head lightly against my shoulder, and I could feel the subtle steadiness of her heartbeat, a quiet reassurance that this connection was grounded in more than fleeting desire. The age gap that might have seemed significant in another context was rendered irrelevant by the sincerity and depth of our bond. Experience and curiosity, wisdom and youth, blended seamlessly in the shared space between us. Over time, our interactions became rituals, small, meaningful, and entirely ours. A shared cup of tea on a rainy night, a quiet walk along the street, laughter spilling softly into the night air. All these moments strengthened the invisible thread connecting us. It was a relationship built on patience, respect, and a mutual willingness to let affection grow slowly, deliberately, without forcing it. By the final evening of the story, we sat on her porch together as the last light of day faded into twilight. Our hands rested comfortably in each other's, and her head leaned lightly against my shoulder. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, giving space to this quiet, enduring intimacy. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic confessions. The emotional closeness we had nurtured over countless nights spoke for itself, and in that quiet, luminous moment, I realized something profound. This was more than attraction or fleeting desire. It was connection, the kind that grows slowly, blossoms naturally, and leaves a lasting warmth that lingers long after the night ends. The silence was no longer loud. It was full of everything we had shared, everything we had built together, and everything we were just beginning to discover.